The following presentation, Nuclear Spent Fuel and Homeland Security, is sponsored by the C10 Foundation and the Citizens Awareness Network. The content of this presentation is based upon 3 detailed technical reports that are available to the public. A citation to one of these reports is provided for each statement in the presentation. This allows viewers of the presentation the opportunity to examine issues in greater depth if they wish to do so. The 2005 National Academy's report on the biological effects of ionizing radiation underscores the need for unprecedented protection from radiation exposure, since it is now accepted there is no safe threshold and children are most vulnerable to its effects. For the sake of our children, we must exercise precaution in our manipulations of the larger world. Let's look at 3 related issues. First, atomic reactors are vulnerable and extremely dangerous terrorist targets because of their spent fuel pools. Second, a successful attack against Seabrook or Vermont Yankee's spent fuel pool could cause catastrophic health and economic consequences for a large area of the Northeast. And third, removing older spent fuel to hardened, bermed, dry cast storage is a relatively inexpensive means to greatly reduce the risk of catastrophic consequence from an attack on a U.S. commercial reactor. According to the National Academies of Science, spent fuel storage facilities cannot be dismissed as targets because of the attractiveness of spent fuel as a terrorist target. The committee judges that attacks by knowledgeable terrorists with access to appropriate technical means are possible. The committee finds that under some conditions, a terrorist attack that partially or completely drained a spent fuel pool could lead to a propagating zirconium cladding fire and the release of large quantities of radioactive materials to the environment. For a typical 1,000 megawatt U.S. pressurized water reactor, the spent fuel pool inventory, 400 tons of spent fuel, contains approximately 35 million curies of cesium-137. This is more than 17 times the cesium-137 released from the Chernobyl accident, where the radiation control zone today comprises an area 1/2 the size of New Jersey. A conservative estimate of the Seabrook spent fuel pool inventory of cesium-137 based on 2003 spent fuel data is 26 million curies. Why do we follow cesium? Cesium-137, with a toxic life of more than 300 years, accounts for most of the off-site radiation exposure that is attributable to the Chernobyl accident. An NRC study has concluded the fraction of the pool's inventory of cesium isotopes that would reach the atmosphere is 100%. A fire in a high-density pool, once initiated, would eventually involve all of the fuel in the pool. Pool buildings are not designed as containment structures. Thus, nuclear power plants and their spent fuel can be regarded as pre-deployed radiological weapons that await activation by an enemy. The U.S. government and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission seem unaware of this fact. While various modes of attack are foreseen, none with the greatest likelihood of causing serious damage can presently be defended against at reactor sites. Seabrook was one of only 4 reactors in the U.S. designed to withstand the impact of an aircraft, specifically a plane weighing 6 tons. The Mach 2 fighter shown here, stationed at Pease Air Force Base during Seabrook's construction, weighs 22 tons empty. Fully fueled commercial aircraft must be considered. Complete combustion of 13,000 gallons of jet fuel, less than a full tank for a Boeing 767, will yield the energy equivalent to 450 tons of TNT. 5,000 gallons, a full tank for a 737, yields energy equivalent to 173 tons of TNT. In September 1982 litigation before the Atomic Safety and Licensing Board, Wells Edelman contended that, quote, the plant's safety analysis was deficient because it did not consider the consequences of terrorists commandeering a very large airplane and diving it into the containment. In rejecting this contention, the ASLB stated, Quote, military-style attacks with heavier weapons are not a part of the design basis threat for commercial reactors. Thus, applicants are not required to design against such things as artillery bombardments, missiles with nuclear warheads, or kamikaze dives by large airplanes, despite the fact that such attacks would damage and may well destroy a commercial reactor. The evidence indicates at least 2 recent plots to target U.S. atomic reactors. Seabrook in 2004 and one earlier. Quote, U.S. authorities have obtained information suggesting that the hijackers of United Airlines Flight 93, which crashed in Pennsylvania on 11 September 2001, were planning to hit a nuclear plant. This may be true or false, or the truth may never be known. Whatever the truth is, it would be foolish to regard nuclear plants as immune from attack. Vermont Yankee spent fuel pool lies just under the white top of the reactor building. Within the spent fuel pool, 35 million curies of cesium-137, only one of many fission byproducts, lay submerged in high-density racks. Note the lack of containment dome. Across the Connecticut River, the hills of Cheshire County, New Hampshire rise toward the city of Keene. Vermont Yankee, Pilgrim in Massachusetts, Fitzpatrick and 9 Mile Point in New York, and the Millstone plant in Connecticut each have one General Electric boiling water reactor with the spent fuel pool on top of the reactor building. The Seabrook probabilistic risk assessment finds that any direct impact on the containment weighing more than 37 tons will lead to penetration of the containment and a breach in the reactor coolant circuit. A similar impact on the control building or auxiliary building will inevitably lead to a core melt. In the absence of any cooling, a freshly discharged core would heat up within an hour to about 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. The zircaloy cladding would be expected to rupture under the internal pressure from helium and fission product gases, and then at about 1650 degrees Fahrenheit, the cladding would begin to burn in the air. An attack on a reactor could lead to a rapid onset core melt with an open containment accompanied by a raging fire. That event would create high radiation fields across the site, potentially precluding any access to the site by personnel. Once a fire has begun, it could be impossible to extinguish. Spraying water on the fire could feed an exothermic zirconium steam reaction that would generate flammable hydrogen. High radiation fields could preclude the approach of firefighters. A 1997 study done for the NRC estimated the median consequences of a spent fuel fire at a pressurized water reactor that released between 8 and 80 million curies of cesium-137. These included between 54,000 and 143,000 extra cancer deaths, 770 to 2,700 square miles of agricultural land condemned, and economic costs due to evacuation of $117 to $566 billion. The increased cancer incidence would apply at the boundary of the uninhabitable area. At some locations within that area, the dose rate would exceed this threshold by orders of magnitude. 35 million curies represents the January 2003 inventory of fuel in cesium-137 within the Vermont Yankee pool. 35 million curies would render about 31,000 square miles uninhabitable. The combined area of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts is 27,000 square miles. The 300 tons of spent fuel Seabrook had accumulated on site by 2003 contains approximately 26 million curies of cesium-137. If an attack on the Seabrook spent fuel pool caused the release of this material, it could render uninhabitable 23,000 square miles, or a radius of 86 miles. What can concerned citizens do? First, we must demand that the atomic power industry return to a low-density, open-frame layout for their spent fuel pools. This restores the safety component of ambient air cooling, which was originally part of the design basis for all reactors. The simplest way to make room for open frame storage at existing reactors is to transfer all spent fuel from wet to dry storage within 5 years of discharge from the reactor. Consequently, our proposal for open frame storage is tied to proposals for dry storage. Dry cask storage for older, cooler spent fuel has two inherent advantages over pool storage. First, it is a passive system that relies on natural air circulation for cooling. Second, it divides the inventory of that spent fuel among a large number of discrete, robust containers. These factors make it more difficult to attack a large amount of spent fuel at one time and also reduce the consequences of such attacks. Shifting fuel to dry cask storage about 5 years after discharge from a reactor would cost $3.5 to $7 billion for dry storage of the approximately 35,000 tons of older spent fuel that would otherwise be stored in U.S. pools by 2010. Typical dry storage installations meet one of the three conditions for robust storage of spent fuel. They are passively safe because their cooling depends on the natural circulation of ambient air. However, none of the existing or proposed installations is hardened, and none of them is dispersed across its site. A spent fuel storage facility can be made resistant to attack in three ways. First, the facility can be made passively safe. Second, the facility can be hardened. Third, the facility can be dispersed. Most of the U.S. spent fuel is stored at high density in water-filled pools that are adjacent to but outside the containments of the reactors. This mode of storage does not meet any of the above-stated three conditions for robustness. The independent spent fuel storage installation must protect spent fuel against a range of possible attacks. The cost should not be dramatically higher than the cost for these installations built according to present practice. The time frame for building these installations should be similar to the time frame for building one according to present practice. And the independent spent fuel storage installation should not, unless absolutely necessary, be built underground. Thousands of tons of U.S. spent fuel will remain in interim storage for decades, even if the repository opens at Yucca Mountain. If the repository does not open, the entire national inventory of spent fuel will remain in interim storage for many decades. Thus, the robust storage strategy for spent fuel must minimize the overall risk of interim storage throughout a period that may extend for 100 years or longer. A number of resources on this CD can help you learn more about the dangers of spent nuclear fuel and the robust storage solution. Included are the full reports on which this presentation is based. The National Academy's report, the Princeton study, and the Thompson report may each be found by clicking on the respective item in the menu of the CD. Also available is the full Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision from June 2006. In this decision, the court found that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission must consider the terrorist threat to spent nuclear fuel installations. Finally, if you would like to learn more about the C10 Research and Education Foundation or the Citizens Awareness Network, links to those organizations' websites are also items in the CD menu.